welcome to the continuation of the second introductory session of ECG Essentials. I'm still your host, Prince. In the first part of this second introductory session, we discussed the ECG paper, some of the information we find on the paper, and the relevance of such information. But in this part of the second introductory session, we want to introduce the waves, the various waves we see on the ECG paper, as well as some of the straight lines that we see on the paper, the waves and the straight lines that we see on the paper. And in this episode, we are not going to go into very much detail. Subsequently, that is in our next episode, we will gently introduce these waves and dissect them one after the other. But today, we want to have just a brief overview of these waves and straight lines. So to do that, let's have a look at some images briefly and take note of as much as we can. Ladies and gentlemen, from these images, we realize that the ECG tracing actually begins with a straight line, a straight line before we see any other deflection. And that straight line or that baseline is called the isoelectric line. It is about this isoelectric line that we see these deflections that are lettered in alphabetical order. And of course, following the tracing, following the deflection, the tracing normally returns to the isoelectric line. The first deflection as shown on this image is the P wave, and of course, the P wave represents atrial depolarization. Following the P wave is a more complex wave called QRS complex. And that QRS complex represents ventricular depolarization. As the name gives it away, it actually looks more complicated as it shows as compared to the P wave. And we can understand this QRS complex actually as being made up of three individual waves. That is the Q portion, the R portion, and the S portion of the QRS complex. We may, however, not see all these aspects of the complex shown in every lead of the ECG. Sometimes some parts of the QRS complex may not appear in some of the leads. When we discuss the various leads in detail in our subsequent episode, we will look at some of these concepts. But simply, we want to put across that the Q portion of the QRS complex is the initial downward deflection. The initial downward deflection, as shown in this image, is what we call the Q portion of the QRS complex. The R portion is the initial upward deflection, whereas the S portion is that downward deflection that follows the upward deflection. So again, the QRS complex is made up of these individual portions or waves, and that is why the waveform actually comes out more complicated as compared to the P wave. Then after the QRS complex, we notice that there is the J point as shown on the image, the J point, the junction point. That is actually what it means, the junction point. And as the name suggests, it is that junction between the termination of the QRS complex and the beginning of the ST segments. The termination of the QRS complex and the beginning of the ST segment. Normally, the J point is situated on or just above the baseline. In certain conditions, we realize that there may be some deviations from the expected position of the J point. Sometimes it may be benign, it may not point to any significant pathology, but sometimes deviation, of these J points may point to more serious events, including various causes of ST segment abnormalities, like even acute myocardial ischemia, even pericarditis. So it may be important to pay attention to the position of the J points, and if there are any deviations, try to interpret it in context. We need to state here that the J wave is not the same as the J point. So we have just discussed J point, but there is also the J wave, which is also called the Osborn wave. And the J wave is different from the J point. The J wave is actually a positive deflection prior to the J point. It's a rather uncommon waveform that may be important in cases like hypothermia, but it is not an everyday waveform that we see on the ECG. Only to clarify that the J point or the junction point is different from the J wave or the Osborn wave. We notice that the next deflection is called the T wave, which represents ventricular repolarization. Having looked at these deflections, we want to delve into or look at the straight lines. And at this point, we want to differentiate between a segment and an interval. So whereas a segment is just a straight line connecting two waves, the interval is a little more than that. The interval encompasses, at least one wave plus the connecting straight line. So an interval will have at least one wave plus a connecting straight line, whereas a segment is just a straight line connecting two waves. With that understanding, we are able to speak of, say, the PR interval as shown on the image, the PR interval, which of course includes the P wave and the straight line that connects the P wave to the QRS complex. So in essence, the PR interval measures the time from the start of atrial depolarization to the start of ventricular depolarization. Next, we see that there is a straight line that is called a PR segment, as shown on the image. And this PR segment is a straight line running from the P wave, running from the end of the P wave to the start of the QRS complex. And this PR segment measures that time from the end of atrial depolarization to the start of ventricular depolarization. And in essence, we can think of it like that a delay in the AV node. The following straight line is the ST segment. And the ST segment is that straight line connecting the end of the QRS complex with the beginning of the T wave. The end of the QRS complex with the beginning of the T wave. And this ST segment measures the time from the end of ventricular depolarization to the start of ventricular repolarization. Next, we see the QT interval. And this QT interval encompasses the QRS complex, the ST segments, as well as the T wave. And of course, that will measure the beginning of ventricular depolarization all the way from the beginning of ventricular depolarization to the end of ventricular repolarization. Ladies and gentlemen, we have mentioned that an interval will usually have at least one wave plus a connecting straight line. But when we say QRS interval, it is an exception. It's an exception because QRS interval is just used to describe the duration of the QRS complex alone, without any connecting straight line. At this point, I'm sure some of our audience may be wondering, where is atrial repolarization? We have discussed all the processes that occur, and we have shown their corresponding ways on the ECG, but no mention has been made of atrial repolarization. It's just because it's not there. Atrial repolarization doesn't show up, on the ECG. And some explanation has been given by some schools of thought. One school of thought explains that it's not there because it is obscured by the subsequent QRS complex, of course, that generates way more voltage. Another school of thought disagrees, and they disagree because they think that if this were so, then in situations where the QRS complex or the QRS is delayed for any reason at all, say maybe in an AV delay, then we'll expect that at least there will be a shadow, of the atrial repolarization, but it is never there. Atrial repolarization is never there. So to this school of thought, it is not there simply because atrial repolarization does not generate substantial voltage to be recorded by electrodes. I must humbly say at this point that these waves and straight lines that we have discussed so far, they are just the common ones that we mostly come across, and of course we mostly may require to make diagnosis. However, there are several others that we haven't introduced yet. There are, of course, we talked about the J wave or the Osborne wave. We have the U wave, which is a positive deflection after the T wave. And of course, we talk about the U wave in conditions like hypokalemia. We have the epsilon wave, the delta wave, which may be talked about in conditions like Wolff, Parkinson, White. So all I'm trying to say is that apart from these various waves that we have seen now, there are others rely on to enhance diagnosis. Similarly, we also realize that the intervals and then the segments as well, there are more of them, like the PP interval, the TP interval, STT segment, etc. That, of course, the senior colleagues may make reference to. But luckily for you and me, ECG Essentials will be focusing mostly on the usual waves and then the straight lines and the segments that we see on the ECG. And so do not panic at all. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us through our initial exposition on the waves of the ECG. As I said, we are going to discuss these waves in more detail in our subsequent episode that comes our way next week, God willing. Thank you again for staying tuned. Kindly keep sharing the videos, drop some likes for us, and subscribe to our channel at ECG Essentials. See you all again soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.